"You're not half the man your brother is," my mom said at dinner. I pushed my chair back and said, "Then he can start paying your rent." Dad turned pale. "Rent? What rent?" I, 32 am, just found out I've been funding my parents' lifestyle while my golden child brother takes all the credit. The fork scraped against my mother's plate with that particular sound that always set my teeth on edge, but tonight it felt like nails on a chalkboard. We were sitting around the dining table at my parents' house, the same table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up, and my mother had just delivered what she probably thought was constructive criticism. She told me, in that casual way that made it hurt worse, that I wasn't half the man my brother was. The words hung in the air like smoke. My wife's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently, a silent plea for me to let it go. But something in me had finally reached its breaking point. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the 15 years of biting my tongue, but I pushed my chair back with enough force that it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I looked my mother dead in the eye and told her that if my brother was such a superior specimen of manhood, perhaps he should start paying their rent. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face drained of color so quickly I thought he might be having a stroke. His mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to ask what rent I was talking about. My mother's expression shifted from smug superiority to something approaching panic in the space of a heartbeat. She started to say something, stumbled over her words, then tried to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But my father wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, and I watched 15 years of carefully maintained lies crumble in his eyes. Let me back up. My brother had always been the golden child. Straight A student, star athlete, charming personality that made everyone love him instantly. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who showed up and did the work without flash or fanfare. When we were growing up, every parent-teacher conference was the same story. My brother's teachers raved about his potential while mine talked about how I was doing fine, just fine, meeting expectations. The pattern continued into adulthood. My brother went to an expensive private university on partial scholarship. I went to state school and worked 2 jobs to pay for it. He graduated with a degree in communications and a network of connections. I graduated with an engineering degree and a job offer. He bounced from startup to startup, always chasing the next big thing, while I climbed the corporate ladder one deliberate rung at a time. 5 years ago, my parents called me with a problem. My father's small business had taken a hit during an economic downturn, and they were struggling with their mortgage. They were facing foreclosure, they said. Could I help, just temporarily, until they got back on their feet? I was newly married, trying to save for a house of my own, but they were my parents. I helped. I restructured their mortgage, paid off their most pressing debts, and set up a monthly payment plan to cover what they couldn't afford. Temporarily, they said. 6 months tops. That was 5 years ago. The payments had continued, month after month, year after year. Sometimes my mother would mention how tight things were, and I'd quietly increase what I was sending. My wife knew about the payments, but she didn't know the full extent. Neither of us realized that what started as mortgage help had evolved into funding their entire lifestyle. Meanwhile, my brother's startup had finally hit. Not huge, but successful enough that he bought a nice condo and a new car. My parents couldn't stop talking about his success, his vision, his brilliance. At every family gathering, every holiday, every casual dinner, the conversation somehow circled back to my brother's achievements. And I took it. I smiled and nodded and congratulated him and kept writing those checks every month because that's what you do for family. But tonight, when my mother made that comment, something snapped. Maybe it was because my wife and I had just found out we were pregnant, and I'd been looking at our finances, really looking at them, and realizing that over 5 years I'd paid my parents nearly $200,000. Maybe it was because my brother had just finished telling a story about his latest vacation to Europe, his 3rd international trip that year, while I couldn't remember the last time my wife and I had gone anywhere. Or maybe it was just because I was tired of being invisible. My father asked me again what rent I was talking about, and this time his voice had an edge to it. So I told him. I told him about the monthly payments, about the restructured mortgage, about the credit card debt I'd paid off, about the new roof and the kitchen renovation and the property taxes. I laid it all out in neat, precise numbers while my mother's face went from pale to red to pale again. My brother, who'd been scrolling on his phone during my mother's initial comment, was now paying attention. He asked why this was the first he was hearing about any of this. That's when my mother finally found her voice. She insisted I was exaggerating, that it hadn't been that much, that they'd always intended to pay me back. She turned to my father with wide, innocent eyes and explained that she hadn't wanted to worry him with the details, that I had offered to help and she'd simply accepted. My father asked her directly if what I was saying was true. Had I been paying their mortgage for 5 years? The deflection attempt was immediate and predictable. She started talking about how successful my brother was, how proud they were, how I clearly had money to spare if I could afford to help them. She suggested that maybe I was just jealous of my brother's success and looking for attention. I pulled out my phone and started reading the transaction history. Every payment, every date, every amount. My voice was steady, almost mechanical. My wife sat beside me, her hand still in mine, and I could feel her shaking. My brother's face had gone through several expressions, finally landing on something between shock and anger. He interrupted my recitation to ask our parents why they'd been telling him they were doing fine financially, why they'd been refusing his offers to help with small things, saying they didn't need it, when apparently they'd been taking substantial amounts from me for years. Our father stood up abruptly, the chair tipping backward and clattering to the floor. He asked my mother how much. How much had she taken from me without telling him? She started crying, which was her usual defense mechanism, but this time it didn't work. My father's voice got quieter, which was always more terrifying than when he yelled. He repeated the question. Through tears, she admitted to the mortgage payments, but insisted everything else was exaggerated. She claimed she'd planned to tell him, had been about to tell him, had been waiting for the right moment. The lies came fast and desperate, contradicting each other. I stood up and told them I was done. No more payments, effective immediately. My wife and I were expecting a baby, and that money needed to go toward our child's future, not toward maintaining the fiction that my brother was the successful one while I was just the dependable backup. My mother's tears stopped like someone had flipped a switch. She snapped that I was being selfish, that family helped family, that after everything they'd done for me, this was how I repaid them? The laugh that came out of me surprised everyone, including myself. I asked her exactly what they'd done for me. Put me through college? I'd paid for that myself. Helped with my wedding? They'd contributed less than my wife's parents, despite having more money at the time. Babysat when we needed it. They were always too busy, usually doing things for my brother. My brother, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He mentioned quietly that they'd told him they couldn't help with his condo down payment because money was tight. He'd assumed they'd hit a rough patch and had been trying to build up his savings to help them once his company stabilized. The expression on my mother's face when she realized both her sons now knew she'd been playing them against each other was almost worth the years of frustration. My father asked us to sit back down, that we needed to talk about this as a family. But I was done talking. I told him he could call me when he was ready to have an honest conversation, but I wasn't going to sit here and be guilt for finally standing up for myself. We left. My wife cried in the car on the way home, apologizing for not pushing me to stand up sooner, for not realizing how bad it had gotten. I told her it wasn't her fault. We'd both been raised to respect our parents, to help family, to keep the peace. We'd both been complicit in our own way. Update 1. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. My mother had sent a series of texts overnight, ranging from apologetic to accusatory to martyred. She was sorry I felt that way, but I had to understand their position. They'd raised me, sacrificed for me, and this was normal family support. Other parents did this for their children, and those children helped in return. She'd always known I resented my brother, and this was just me acting out. My brother called around noon. We'd never been particularly close despite growing up in the same house. Our relationship more obligation than genuine friendship. But his voice on the phone was different than I'd ever heard it. He told me he'd stayed at our parents' house after we left. The fight that followed had apparently lasted until 3 in the morning. Our father had gone through bank statements, credit card bills, every financial record he could find. The amount I'd been sending was actually the tip of the iceberg. Our mother had been using my payments to maintain a lifestyle well beyond what our father's business income could support. The European vacation my brother had mentioned? Our parents had gone too, just not with him. The new car our mother drove? Financed. But the payments were coming from what I sent. The country club membership she'd joined 2 years ago? Courtesy of my monthly transfers. My father had been living in a completely different financial reality than the one that actually existed. He'd thought the business was doing better than it was because my mother handled the household finances. She'd been intercepting bank statements, managing bills, and creating an illusion of stability that didn't exist. My brother asked me why I'd never said anything to him. We could have compared notes, figured this out years ago. I didn't have a good answer. Pride, maybe. Not wanting to cause problems. The same reason he'd never mentioned their refusal of his help, I supposed. We'd both been trying to be good sons in our own ways, never realizing we were being played against each other. He told me he'd confronted our mother directly about the golden child treatment, about the constant comparisons, about using me as a piggy bank while praising him as the successful one. She'd deflected at first, then admitted she'd thought if she praised him enough, I'd be motivated to try harder, to be more like him. She'd genuinely believed she was helping both of us. The twisted logic was almost impressive. My father called that evening. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. He apologized for not knowing, for not paying attention, for letting this happen. He'd filed for divorce that morning. The news hit harder than I expected. My parents had been married for 35 years. My father explained that this wasn't just about the money or the lying, though that was bad enough. It was about the systematic manipulation, the playing favorites, the pitting his sons against each other. He'd spent the day talking to a lawyer and looking at the full financial picture. It was worse than he'd thought. Without my payments, they couldn't afford the house. His business was barely breaking even. They had credit card debt he hadn't known about, personal loans in both their names, and a second mortgage my mother had taken out without telling him. The financial house of cards was collapsing. He told me he didn't expect me to keep helping, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to them again. But he asked if I'd be willing to meet with him alone, without my mother, to talk. My wife thought it was a trap. She'd never fully trusted my mother, had always sensed something off about the family dynamics. But she'd kept quiet because she didn't want to cause problems. Now she wasn't staying quiet anymore. She told me if I wanted to meet my father, fine, but she was coming with me, and we were meeting in a public place. We met at a coffee shop the next Saturday. My father looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. He'd moved into a rental apartment, was sleeping on an air mattress, had taken exactly what he needed and nothing more. He showed me the financial documents, everything laid out and organized. He'd always been meticulous about his business records, but had trusted my mother completely with household finances. That trust had been catastrophically misplaced. He explained that he wanted to sell the house, split the proceeds, and use his half to pay me back as much as possible. It wouldn't be everything, probably not even half, but it was a start. He was also ramping up his business, taking on projects he'd previously turned down, cutting his own expenses to bare bones. I told him he didn't have to do that. The money was gone, and I'd made peace with it. He insisted he did have to do it. Not because of the money, but because he'd failed as a father. He'd been so focused on keeping the business afloat that he'd missed what was happening in his own home. He'd let my mother's favoritism continue unchecked, had made excuses for it, had told himself it wasn't that bad. He'd failed both his sons in different ways. My brother had been paying for my mother's apartment. The revelation came out halfway through the conversation, almost casually. After the divorce filing, she'd moved out immediately, and my brother had offered to cover her rent for a few months while she figured things out. He was still trying to be the good son, still trying to fix things. I asked my father if he'd told my brother about the full extent of the financial damage. He had. My brother's response had been to immediately stop paying our mother's rent. He'd told her she could move in with friends, family, or figure it out on her own, but he was done enabling her manipulation. She'd called me 17 times that day. I hadn't answered. Update 2. 3 months later, the baby came. A girl, healthy and perfect in hours. My parents had still not met her, though my father had sent a card and a small gift. My mother had sent nothing but continued text messages that swung wildly between apologetic and accusatory. The house sold. My father gave me a check for $60,000, about a third of what I'd paid over the years. He'd wanted to give me more, but the debt load had eaten most of the equity. I deposited the check and immediately put it in our daughter's college fund. My brother had started coming around more. We'd never been close, but crisis had a way of stripping away pretense. We'd grab lunch every few weeks, talk about real things instead of the performative family dynamics we'd grown up with. He'd admitted that the golden child treatment had been its own kind of prison. Every success had to be celebrated, every failure hidden. The pressure to live up to the image our mother had created had nearly broken him several times. We were both, in our own ways, recovering from the same childhood. My mother had moved in with her sister 3 states away. The distance was probably for the best. She still called occasionally, still sent messages that suggested she didn't really understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, she'd been a devoted mother who'd made some financial mistakes, not someone who'd systematically manipulated her family for years. My father had become a different person, quieter, more thoughtful, but also more present. He'd asked to meet his granddaughter when she was a month old. We'd met at a park, neutral territory, and he'd held her with shaking hands and tears in his eyes. He'd apologized again, not for the money, but for all the times he'd let the comparison happen, all the times he'd stayed silent when he should have spoken up. I'd forgiven him, not because the hurt was gone, but because holding on to it wasn't serving anyone. The story had rippled through our extended family. Aunts and uncles who'd witnessed years of the golden child dynamic suddenly had context for behaviors they'd found puzzling. Cousins reached out to share their own stories of parental favoritism and financial manipulation. What I'd thought was a unique family dysfunction turned out to be depressingly common. My wife had been right about everything. She'd seen the dynamic clearly from the outside, had tried to gently point it out over the years, but I'd been too close to see it. The pregnancy had given me clarity I hadn't had before. I'd looked at our daughter and realized I never wanted her to feel the way I'd felt, never wanted her to be invisible in her own family, never wanted her to question her worth based on comparison to someone else. That realization had been worth more than any apology. The last conversation I'd had with my mother had been brief. She'd called to tell me she'd started therapy, that she was working on herself, that she hoped someday I could forgive her. I told her I hoped therapy helped her, but that forgiveness wasn't something she was owed. It was something she'd have to earn, if it came at all. She'd started to argue, to explain, to justify, and I'd hung up. My brother had asked me recently if I thought we'd ever have a normal relationship with our mother. I told him I didn't know what normal looked like anymore, but I knew what I wouldn't accept. I wouldn't accept being treated as less than, being used as a financial resource, being compared unfavorably. If she couldn't offer more than that, then distance was the healthiest option. He nodded slowly and admitted he'd come to the same conclusion. We were building something new, my brother and I. Not the relationship we'd had, which had been shallow and performative, but something real. We were learning to be brothers instead of competitors, to support each other instead of being played against each other. It was awkward and imperfect, but it was honest. My father had met my brother's girlfriend last month. She was smart and kind and didn't take any nonsense. When my father had started to apologize again for everything, she'd cut him off gently and told him that showing up consistently mattered more than perfect words. He'd taken that to heart. The money still stung sometimes. Not because of the amount, though that hurt, but because of what it represented. Years of being taken for granted, of being the responsible one who could be counted on to show up and solve problems without recognition or appreciation. But I was learning to let that go, to focus on what I was building instead of what had been taken. My daughter would grow up knowing both her grandfathers, but having boundaries with her grandmother. She'd grow up watching her parents support each other as equals, watching her father and uncle treat each other with respect, watching what healthy family dynamics looked like. She wouldn't be anyone's golden child or invisible child. She'd just be herself, loved completely for who she was. That dinner table confrontation had blown up my family, but it had also freed me from a dynamic that was slowly poisoning my life. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn approval that was never going to come, trying to measure up to a standard that was designed to keep me striving but never arriving. I was done striving. I was done measuring. I was done being half the man my brother was. I was exactly the man I needed to be, and that was enough.